Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a housing association that cut off the power to my house. Growing up, I always heard stories about our lake house. My grandfather, Wilton, had been among the first in the region to secure a permit back when only 3 to 5 licenses were granted for private lakefront homes. Everyone else in the vicinity clamored for a chance to live right on the water. But thanks to a combination of good timing, shrewd negotiation, and maybe even a bit of luck, Grandfather Wilton managed to lock down the final permit. He built a cozy log structure, complete with a stone chimney and a small deck that extended right to the shore. Over the decades, almost all of those neighboring lake houses fell into disrepair or were knocked down. Ours remained standing, albeit in desperate need of maintenance, largely because my grandfather, and later my dad, poured their hearts into its upkeep. From the time I could walk, I found peace at that property. Summers were spent splashing around in a rowboat or tossing pebbles into the water from the rickety dock. Winters meant tucking ourselves indoors, playing board games by the glow of the fireplace, occasionally daring to step outside to watch the snow blanket the frozen lake. I always felt like the luckiest kid in the world. Most of my friends from school had never even seen a private lake house up close, and sometimes I'd sneak them in to roast marshmallows or dangle their feet off the dock. It wasn't a place of extravagance, though. The structure was sturdy but modest, and despite its tremendous sentimental value, it never had the glamorous look many associate with modern lakefront mansions. When my grandfather passed, my father took over responsibility for the house, but as the years went by, my parents moved for work, then retirement, and eventually I inherited the property. I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. I had spent my entire childhood daydreaming about living in that rustic cabin for good, renovating it into a comfortable year-round dwelling. My father granted me that dream in his will. So, after carefully saving up for renovations, I sold my suburban condo and settled permanently in the lake house. That decision dropped me straight into the center of a local controversy I didn't see coming. See, there's this local homeowners association that claims jurisdiction over our entire area, including the roads leading to the lake. Their rules, in theory, are meant to maintain property values, keep the roads plowed in winter, and handle neighborhood cleanliness. But I learned the hard way that certain board members wield their influence like a personal fiefdom. I had little idea what I was in for until the day I hosted a low-key housewarming gathering for a couple of friends. Only about 5 people came, all from out of town. We grilled some burgers, enjoyed the view, and had a quiet celebration. That night, I discovered a passive-aggressive note taped to my door. Next time you have guests over, kindly inform the community so we can coordinate. This property is part of the HOA, and compliance with events is required. I remember reading the note at least 3 times, convinced I was misunderstanding it. Events? Compliance? Required? For having a personal party at my own house? Initially, I chuckled. That had to be a silly misunderstanding. I was certain I'd never joined the HOA, at least not formally. I wasn't even aware that the lake house had been bound by any such agreement. My grandfather's permit was older than the HOA's entire existence. I decided to ignore the note for the time being, figuring it would resolve itself once I explained to whoever left it that, historically, the property had never been subject to their association. Just a few days later, I got another note, this time on official letterhead. "We'd like to confirm your property for the next Community Lake Day." The letter went on to describe how, every summer, residents gather for a day of barbecues, boat rides, and family events by the water. In prior years, apparently, they used a public beach near the dam, but, according to them, now that we have an inhabitable lake house within our association boundaries, we can relocate the festivities to a cozier setting. Your place. My blood pressure shot up. I was flabbergasted by their assumption that they could just announce an event in my backyard. I'd never heard from them before, never paid dues, never was part of their community events. Sure, I wanted to be a good neighbor, but to them it was more like I had no choice in the matter. I decided it was time to speak to someone face to face. I walked to the HOA office, a small building near the entrance to our neighborhood, where a woman named Dahlia greeted me. I explained that I had inherited the property from my grandfather, that I had never signed up for membership, and that I certainly never gave permission for big events at my home. Dahlia listened patiently, nodded, offered me a cookie from a plastic container on her desk, and then said, "That's sweet, dear, but the board voted that all properties in the area must abide by the HOA rules, including lakefront sites. You can't choose to be outside of it, especially if it's a single-family home along the roads we maintain. I tried not to lose my cool. Instead, I asked for a copy of the contract that tied my house to this association. She disappeared into a back room, rummaged through a filing cabinet, and returned with a thick folder that apparently belonged to a man named Lionel who had lived around the corner. She frowned and admitted she didn't have the records for my place. But, she added, I'm sure it's just in the older files. We'll find it eventually. We have authority to impose guidelines on all homes here since the 1980s. That raised an eyebrow for me. My grandfather's permit and the original property deed dated back nearly 8 decades, well before the 1980s. I was pretty certain any attempt to fold my land into a newly created HOA would require a contract or something specific, which we never had. I thanked her and left, feeling uneasy but hopeful that logic would prevail. After all, there was no way they could force me to open my home for the neighborhood if I'd never joined. About a week passed and another letter arrived in my mailbox. This one accused me of failure to comply with community requests. It threatened fines, stating that I was in violation of Section 12, Clause 3, with the possibility of further action if I continued to resist. Resentment boiled up inside me. Who did these people think they were? Instead of paying any so-called fine, I prepared a carefully worded letter explaining that I did not, and never had, agreed to the association. I included photocopies of the original deed referencing my grandfather's permit status and stating that the property was established well before the HOA's existence. Your claims of authority over this land are not valid, I wrote, and I expect no further threats about my private property. That's when petty turned into downright malicious. Early one morning, I was enjoying coffee on the deck when my neighbor Gideon ambled over. He's a chatty guy who's lived down the road for decades. He told me some rumors flying around about how I was destroying the neighborhood spirit by refusing to host social gatherings. He also mentioned that the HOA president, an individual named Maribel, was extremely upset that I wouldn't budge. Maribel had apparently told people that I owed it to the neighborhood to share the lakeshore. I recall Gideon shaking his head, telling me, "They're out for blood. Don't be surprised if they pull something, especially if they find a legal loophole." I tried not to let it get to me, but sure enough, I learned just how vindictive they could be. 2 weeks after that conversation with Gideon, during an unseasonably hot afternoon, I noticed the air conditioning had shut off. Then I realized the lights wouldn't come on. The entire house had lost power. My first assumption was a simple outage. The region occasionally faces blackouts when the local grid gets overloaded. I waited an hour, but saw no utility trucks passing on the road. I checked my phone for notifications from the electric company, but had nothing. Eventually, I walked out to the main breaker panel at the property's edge, only to discover a bright red padlock on it. A note was pinned right below. Due to repeated non-compliance, your property's electricity has been suspended. Restore your standing with the community to resume service. I stood there dumbfounded. This was a blatant sabotage. Our utility lines run through local infrastructure that the HOA apparently helps fund, but they have no legal right to just disconnect me. The note's message was basically blackmail. If you don't host our events, we'll make life impossible for you. I remember my heart pounding in my chest as I walked around the house, making sure there wasn't some other explanation. But there it was, a brand new lock that clearly didn't belong to the power company. I called the electric company's emergency line to confirm. Their representative told me there were no outages in my area and that my account was in good standing. They insisted they never sent anyone out. I asked if a private party could tamper with the supply and was told that it would be highly illegal. That was all I needed to hear. I rang a locksmith friend in a town about 30 minutes away. He came by that afternoon, took one look at the padlock and said, "This is definitely not a standard utility lock. I can snap it off, but let's be careful to note everything in writing. This is evidence." I took pictures. I recorded video. I documented everything. After we got rid of the lock, he checked the breaker. Sure enough, it had been manually switched off. He turned it back on and the house lit up again. My next call was to a local attorney, someone I'd used in the past for a small real estate purchase. She was appalled by the HOA's behavior and assured me that under no circumstances could they do such a thing legally. Even if I were part of the HOA, they'd typically have to go through a court to impose a lien or a financial penalty if I refused to pay dues. Physically disconnecting power without my consent was beyond the pale. So, at her advice, I filed a police report for trespassing and tampering with utilities. Then, I put in a call to a civil litigation lawyer she recommended. The next day, I also had a property boundary survey done just to double-check that the small strip of land with the electrical meter was indeed mine and not under HOA ownership. It was mine. Confirmed. For about a month, I continued living as usual, though I upgraded some of my security cameras. I half expected them to try other stunts, maybe shutting off my water or blocking my driveway. The HOA's letters kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. One threatened that if I didn't open my home for their fall harvest picnic, they'd withhold community services. Another said that if I were a good neighbor, I'd share my privilege. Mind you, I still wasn't even listed on their membership rolls. They had no official documents to prove I was under their jurisdiction. I deduced they simply wanted to bully me into compliance. The biggest bombshell came when I attended a private mediation session with the HOA board. My lawyer had arranged it, hoping we could settle the dispute without going to court. There were about 6 board members present, led by Maribel. The entire time they tried to twist the narrative into me being a freeloader who benefited from living in a well-maintained neighborhood while refusing to pay dues or follow the rules. My attorney calmly asked them to produce any documentation that my property was part of their association. They didn't have anything. They started referencing new developments in the area from the 1980s. She countered by showing them my grandfather's original permit from over 80 years ago. Their frustration was palpable. Finally, Maribel made a desperate argument. Even if the original property wasn't under the HOA, you made external renovations, which we regulate. My lawyer asked them to show official building codes or permit applications that required going through the HOA. They had none. It grew heated, especially when I brought up the unlawful power disconnection. I showed them pictures of the lock, the note, everything. They tried to deny involvement. One board member muttered, "That's not an official HOA lock," while another insisted, "We never authorized shutting your power off. Maybe your electrician messed up." My lawyer reminded them that we had filed a police report and that, if I proceeded, there would likely be subpoenas for the board members to appear in court. In the end, the mediation was a dead end, but I left feeling vindicated. It was clear I had a solid case if we went to court, and that's precisely what happened when we couldn't come to an agreement, and I pressed forward with a lawsuit. The suit alleged trespassing, illegal utility tampering, and harassment. I wanted them to formally acknowledge that my land was never and would never be under their authority. I also sought damages for the stress, the expenses, and the time off work I had to take to deal with this nonsense. My lawyer was confident we'd win, and maybe even recoup costs. While the legal process in the United States can be notoriously slow, we were able to schedule a hearing relatively quickly, presumably because it wasn't an overly complicated land dispute, but rather an argument about an invalid attempt to forcibly subject a property to HOA rules. In that time, the harassment continued, but in subtler ways. Some neighbors who were apparently in Maribel's inner circle would leave their cars parked near my driveway entrance, forcing me to navigate awkwardly around them. One family tried to have a yard sale on my property line, setting up tables half on my grass. When I asked them to move, they claimed, "We have permission from the HOA." I threatened to call the police. They packed up but spat out some nasty remarks about me being anti-community. A separate plot line in this saga involved a local historian named Catalina. She was working on a piece about the original families who settled around the lake. She reached out to me because she'd heard about my grandfather's involvement and the original building permits. Catalina had read about the heated friction with the HOA and wanted my perspective. She was surprised, but not entirely shocked, that a modern HOA was trying to commandeer a historically private property. Through her research, she found old newspaper clippings praising my grandfather for preserving the lake's natural beauty. She even discovered an archive of letters referencing how he explicitly turned down an offer to join a neighborhood association decades ago, long before this particular HOA formed, because he felt it was a step toward reducing the land's authenticity. Catalina ended up testifying in court, sharing the historical context that the property was always separate. The day the trial finally arrived, I was both anxious and strangely excited to have it all come to a head. My lawyer presented the evidence methodically. The original deed, the permit, pictures of the lock, testimonies confirming the house predated the HOA by decades. Meanwhile, the HOA's attorney tried to argue that the roads leading to my house were maintained by the association, so that should grant them some measure of authority. But we had county records proving that the road was actually a county-maintained road. The HOA only handled the smaller side roads not used for direct access to the lake house. This dismantled a major plank of their argument. They claimed I gained unjust enrichment from certain shared community improvements, like newly installed streetlights. But my lawyer pointed out that those streetlights were paid for by the county after a local initiative. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that the power lines were owned or partially managed by the HOA, but the actual records from the electric company showed that the lines and service were operated under a public utility contract. The HOA had zero rightful claim to them. Finally, the judge hammered them on the power disconnection incident. She looked distinctly unimpressed as the board members squirmed. There was no justification for their meddling with my electricity, and even their own counsel had to concede that whoever placed that lock did so without the board's official knowledge. It sounded hollow. After what felt like a marathon session, the court decisively ruled in my favor. Not only did the judge declare that my house was not under the HOA's governance, but she also found that the HOA's actions amounted to harassment. While evidence was mostly circumstantial regarding who physically placed the lock, the judge cited the repeated threatening notices and the board's overall attempts to coerce compliance. The ruling granted me a modest financial award, enough to cover my legal fees, plus a bit extra for my trouble. It wasn't a staggering sum, but it was the principle that mattered. The judge also authorized a restraining order preventing the HOA from interfering with my property in any way without going through the court. The aftermath was just as dramatic. The HOA president, Maribel, stepped down from her position within a month. Rumor in the neighborhood was that the other board members blamed her for steering them into a losing lawsuit. Dahlia, the woman who worked at the HOA office, stopped by my house one afternoon and apologized, claiming she'd just been following orders. She offered me a homemade pie as a peace offering. It was a bit awkward. I accepted the pie, but politely refused to let her see inside my home. I'd had enough community gatherings for a lifetime. She did mention that there were calls from other neighbors to oust more board members who had gone along with Maribel's vengeful actions. Meanwhile, Gideon, ever the friendly, chatty neighbor, filled me in on all the local gossip. He told me how the board tried to spin the court loss by saying the judge was biased or didn't understand the complexities. But Gideon said the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. Some folks who'd supported the HOA realized how extreme and petty its leadership had become, especially after the truth about the utility tampering came out. People were afraid that if the board got away with it at my house, it could happen to anyone who dared question them. Interestingly, Catalina's historical research ended up being significant beyond the trial. She organized a small event, held at a local community center, not at my house, to showcase the origins of the lake area, including photos of the old properties and the few families who'd built their homes there under those rare permits. I was invited as a guest of honor. It was quite a pleasant day. I gave a short speech thanking everyone for preserving the memories of my grandfather and the others who had lived and loved the lake. The overwhelming sentiment from the crowd was gratitude that the place still existed in some semblance of its original form. With the threat of the HOA pushing me around effectively neutralized, I could finally focus on improving the house. I undertook a few renovations, refinishing the hardwood floors, updating the plumbing, and replacing the aging windows. A side story, though, happened during the time I was arranging these renovations. An acquaintance named Quincy, who works in home restoration, asked if he could film a short segment about my property for a local history and renovation show. Initially, I was excited to showcase the house's character, but soon enough, the idea made me nervous because it might attract more attention from the same people who thought they had a right to come onto my property whenever they wanted. I ended up politely declining, stating I'd had enough drama with strangers. Quincy respected my decision. Despite the legal resolution, I did have a couple more minor run-ins with die-hard supporters of the old HOA board. One day, I caught a neighbor attempting to fish off my dock without asking. Now, I'm generally happy for people to fish if they're respectful, but this gentleman, Trent, had been part of the group that publicly blamed me for ruining the community spirit. When I approached him, he started ranting about how the lake is for everyone in the neighborhood. He tried to argue that he had the right to fish from any point on the shore. I reminded him that my dock was on private property. If he wanted to float out on the lake from the public ramp, be my guest. But stepping onto my deck and dock was trespassing. He continued to rant, so I called out for him to leave immediately or face charges. He huffed, reeled in his line, and stomped off while muttering that the HOA had the right idea. Another plotline involved a younger couple, Presley and B, who moved in a few houses away. They'd heard all about the drama, but had never been present for it themselves. They approached me at the mailbox one morning, introduced themselves, and politely asked if I'd ever consider letting them hold a small wedding ceremony on the lawn, right by the lake. They offered to pay a rental fee, sign any waivers, and keep the guest list under 50 people. Their pitch was incredibly courteous, acknowledging that it might be an imposition. It was a stark contrast to the HOA's bullying approach. Honestly, a small wedding for a sweet, respectful couple sounded kind of nice, but after everything I'd been through, I was wary. I told them I'd think about it. They left me their phone number and said they understood if I declined. After a few days, I decided I could let them use the space, provided we had a detailed written agreement that spelled out the date, the time, the number of guests, and the scope of their setup, tents, chairs, etc., plus a solid deposit to cover any potential damage. I wasn't out to be mean, but I also needed to protect my property. We had a meeting at my dining table, hammered out the agreement, shook hands, and parted ways on great terms. A month later, they held a simple, charming ceremony under a canopy of oak trees. The bride walked down a small aisle, the sun shimmered on the water, and for once, the presence of neighbors on my property felt wholesome, not forced. It was a delicate reminder that I was never against sharing the beauty of the lake. I only wanted it to be my choice to share, not forced upon me by some power-hungry organization. Speaking of organizations, the newly restructured HOA board eventually sent me a letter, signed by a new president named Marco. It read, "We acknowledge the court's decision and want to foster better relations in the neighborhood. While we respect your right to exclude your property from HOA jurisdiction, we hope you will still consider participating in voluntary community events." It was a far cry from the threatening letters I used to receive. I didn't respond right away, but I was grateful they seemed to have turned over a new leaf. Gideon mentioned that Marco was an avid advocate for property rights, ironically enough, and that he had personally apologized on behalf of the HOA to multiple neighbors who'd been bullied in the past. So, maybe the association could finally do some good for the area. Only time would tell. As for me, day-to-day life by the water is blissfully quiet now. A few times a year, curious onlookers walk the perimeter of the lake, but since the ruling, none have tried to cross onto my land without permission. I make a point to wave and greet folks from a distance, but I maintain the boundary lines. I've installed a newer gate, more discreet cameras, and posted a single sign that reads, "Private property. Please respect." The fiasco may have turned me slightly more cautious, but it hasn't stolen my joy in living here. One unexpected silver lining was that my story caught the attention of a local conservation group. They reached out to see if I'd be interested in working with them to preserve portions of the natural lake habitat. It was a chance to continue my grandfather's legacy of caring for the land. We're in the early stages of planning a lakeside cleanup. The difference here is that it's entirely voluntary, and the group respects my rights. They asked me for permission before placing a few educational signs by the edge of the water about local wildlife. They assured me the signs would be off my property, clearly on public land. We had a good conversation about the type of birds and fish that inhabit these waters. They even offered me free seeds for planting native grasses along the shoreline to prevent erosion. During those discussions with the conservationists, I reflected on how it might have turned out if the HOA had approached me in a similar spirit, asking for my collaboration instead of asserting they had a right to use my land. Things might have been different. Perhaps we could have organized some lovely community gatherings that everyone enjoyed, but their approach was so antagonistic, it burned the bridge before we could even meet in the middle. In the months following the court victory, I also found myself thinking about my grandfather's unwavering dedication. He probably never imagined an HOA would come along to claim dominion over the place he built with his own hands. I've taken to tidying up the small memorial I set up for him in the living room. It's nothing grand, just a couple of black and white pictures, a jar of lake water that I collected on the morning of his funeral, and a framed excerpt from one of his journals. In that excerpt, he wrote, "The lake reminds me each day that life is fluid and free, not bound by any man's rules." It feels oddly poetic that decades later, I ended up in a battle precisely over the freedom of this lake. I won't pretend that I'm an anti-community hermit or that I want nothing to do with neighbors. I still chat with folks at the local grocery store, and I joined a volunteer group that organizes 4th of July fireworks. though we hold them from a public vantage point, not on my private property. I'm open to neighborly goodwill, just on my terms. If someone wants to ask permission to use the dock for a quick photo shoot, maybe I'll say yes. If a local teacher wants to have a small educational session for kids about fish habitats, again, maybe I'll say yes. But never again will I be forced or threatened into compliance. That's one lesson the HOA hammered into me. I also know now how crucial it is to have proper legal documents ready to defend your property rights. Never assume that just because something is historically separate, no one will try to usurp it. It feels satisfying to have emerged victorious, though I'll admit the stress was considerable. There were nights I paced my living room, furious that a group of strangers thought they could commandeer something so personal and tie it up with their bureaucratic nonsense. But I guess it's also a testament to the importance of standing up for oneself, especially when you know you're in the right. When I replay it in my mind, I sometimes wonder if there was a simpler route. But given how the HOA refused to budge until it was forced by law, I doubt we could have resolved it any other way. I'm grateful for the judge who saw through their shaky claims. I'm grateful for my lawyer who calmly sliced through every argument they presented. And I'm grateful for the friends, like Gideon, who dropped by to give me heads-ups on the board's gossip. After the court's decision, my next biggest project was revamping the old dock. Over the years, it had started to sag a bit, and a few boards were rotted. With the help of a handyman named Brantley, I spent several weekends replacing and staining the planks, reinforcing the supports, and adding a new row of solar-powered lights along the edges. Now, in the evenings, my dock glows faintly against the rippling water. Sometimes, if it's warm enough, I'll sit out there under the stars with a fishing rod, not necessarily aiming to catch anything, just to savor the peace and quiet. Often, I think about how close I was to losing this sense of privacy. If the HOA had succeeded in making my lake house a de facto community clubhouse, I might never have a calm night to myself again. Ironically, the once broken relationships in the neighborhood have begun to mend, at least partially. Some neighbors openly told me they had no idea the HOA was trying to forcibly annex me. Others apologized for believing the board's spin. They now wave from their yards when I drive by. A few have even said they hope to petition the new leadership for more transparent and voluntary approaches, rather than the old mandatory compliance system. Time will tell if that effort sticks. At least Maribel and her closest allies aren't harassing me anymore. I heard she moved to a different community entirely, presumably one where she can find a fresh group to lord over. But that's not my concern anymore. In a way, my victory in court has turned into something bigger. Several other homeowners discovered that their property lines, or the scope of the HOA's authority over them, were questionable too. A small wave of challenges popped up after my case. While I don't relish the idea of new lawsuits, I appreciate that folks are now standing up for themselves, reading the fine print of their deeds, and verifying exactly what they signed up for. Maybe the new board will handle things more responsibly, so it doesn't degrade into further conflict. If so, that would be a win for everyone. As for the financial payout I received, I decided to use some of it to set up a small scholarship fund at the local high school in honor of my grandfather. It's earmarked for students who show interest in environmental conservation or local history. It might not be a gigantic sum, but it's something that'll hopefully keep the spirit of the lake alive in future generations. When I told Catalina about this plan, she was ecstatic. She said that the more people learn about our area's heritage, the less likely they are to fall prey to petty power plays that ignore history. Friends, thank you. See you soon.